Hi, everyone. I'm so pleased to greet you today for this online Laser Talks. I'm Rachel Nelson, Director of the Institute of the Arts and Sciences at UC Santa Cruz. LASER stands for Leonardo Art and Science Evening Rendezvous and are an international program bringing together artists, scientists, and scholars for presentations and conversations. For those of you who are familiar with our Laser Talks here at UC Santa Cruz, you know that these short presentations introduce the work of our faculty and other artists and researchers to broad publics. We've been hosting Laser Talks for 7 years, and it's always a pleasure to gather people together from varied fields of research. At the IAS, we organize a range of programming open to our students and our community, from art exhibitions to artist talks to other discussions. I've always particularly enjoyed lasers because they allow for thinking between disciplines and offer profound insight to the varied kinds of approaches through which artists and researchers ask critical questions. Laser Talks don't have a theme, so as we hear from scholars today, note that what we're interested in doing is not illuminating one site of research or one mode of scholarship or creative practice, but instead think about the multiple approaches that abound as we look to understand histories and the world around us. We're grateful for photography historian Jasmine Alinder and geographer Katharyne Mitchell to share their research and methodologies with us today. This is a special treat because both Dr. Allender and Mitchell are not only important scholars, but they're also both deans on campus in the humanities and the social sciences. This means their scholarships and approaches they take to research have important resonances for the university, refracting into their leadership and advocacy for faculty and students across campus. So tonight I'll introduce Jasmine Alinder very briefly, as I'm sure everyone's getting eager to get to the presentations. And then after Dr. Allender's presentation, we'll pop back in to introduce Dr. Mitchell. We'll leave questions until after both talks, and IAS faculty co-director Jennifer Gonzalez will join us for questions. But do add questions into the Q&A throughout the time. We won't lose them and we'll come back to them. So on to introductions. Jasmine Alinder is Dean of the Humanities and Professor of History at UC Santa Cruz. She is an interdisciplinary, community-engaged scholar and teacher of public history, the history of photography, and the history of Japanese Americans during World War II. As a historian of photography, her research investigates what she characterizes as the presumptive right to the camera. She's the author of Moving Images, Photography, and the Japanese American Incarceration. Thanks, Jasmine. I'll bring you in now. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
Thanks.
Thanks everyone for taking time out of your day to attend these laser talks. I want to say at the outset, since I just began my position in August, that I'm really honored to be working together with the faculty, staff, and students at UC Santa Cruz as the new Dean of Humanities. And I also want to say that a particular highlight for me has been working closely with the other deans, and in particular, the great Katherine Mitchell. So I am going to start screen sharing now and show you my images in my presentation. Okay, so I'm hoping you're seeing the slide now. So today what I'd like to talk about is some of my research and public scholarship on photography and Japanese American incarceration. Much of my work as a scholar examines why photography is so important to this history. I argue that during the incarceration of Japanese Americans, photography became what I call a representational battleground. I'd like to take you through a few examples from my research that show how images work, not as windows on the past, but as contested forms of representation. At the end, I'd like to share with you a related digital humanities project that I've collaborated on, which is targeted to K-12 students. I also want to say that I'm really looking forward to learning more about the Japanese American experience in Santa Cruz County, and want to say hello and give special thanks to Mas Hashimoto, who I just met via email. Mr. Hashimoto grew up in Watsonville and was incarcerated as a young boy, first in the Salinas Assembly Center and then in Poston, Arizona, and has shared his story with me and his wisdom in many venues, including a TEDx talk and an oral history with Densho. So the struggle over photography figured in many aspects of the imprisonment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Initially, the camera was both a target and tool of repression. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, the FBI conducted raids, and many Japanese Americans destroyed artifacts, including family photographs, that might have been construed as evidence of a link to Japan. So this image shows an FBI agent as he conducts such a raid and examines the family photo album. The military criminalized Japanese Americans through identity photographs and prohibited cameras in the concentration camps. The government classified the camera as a weapon of war in the same category as guns, bombs, and ammunition. The image on the right depicts the surrendering of cameras and radios in Seattle. Images were used to designate Japanese Americans as incarcerable and unworthy of the rights of citizenship, like the mugshot you see on the left. But in March of 1942, the War Relocation Authority, formed by executive order, took over the administration of the incarceration from the military. The WRA, a civilian agency, mobilized photography to publicize and record the work, its work, and the conformity of those incarcerated to the government's orders. The task of the camera in this new context was to portray the incarceration process as efficient, humane, and orderly, as exemplified by the photograph you see on the right. This shift in emphasis toward efficiency and order may seem surprising given the WRA's function as jailers, but this strategy was in full accord with the agency's mission, which included the facilitation of the reassimilation of the evacuees, the so-called evacuees, into the normal currents of American life. Viciously racist representations were commonplace in the popular press. Here is an example, a cartoon published in February 1942 by Theodore Geisel, otherwise known as Dr. Seuss, in which a homogeneous mass of smiling men line up to grab their boxes of TNT from a shop called Honorable Fifth Column. Or in text, as a columnist in the Los Angeles Times wrote, quote, "A viper is nonetheless a viper wherever the egg is hatched." So a Japanese American born of Japanese parents, notwithstanding his nominal brand of accidental citizenship, grows up to be a Japanese, not an American, and himself is a potential and menacing danger to our country, end quote. The WRA wanted to use photography to reverse damage done by previous representations like these that conflated Japanese Americans with the enemy. So the WRA took on a contradictory representational task, portraying Japanese Americans as productive, loyal citizens, while at the same time condoning their imprisonment. The WRA's representation of Japanese Americans as fit for participation in American civic life, as deserving of an existence outside of the concentration camps, hinged implicitly on its opposite pole, the purportedly dangerous, disloyal Japanese American. Throughout the incarceration, the camera created and reinforced the stark terms that separated Japanese Americans into these two mutually constituted categories, the loyal citizen and the disloyal enemy. Photography served as a kind of visual gatekeeper, as photographs became integral to the articulation of the boundaries that divided those who were deemed to be fit into the body politic and those who were excluded. Photographer Dorothea Lange was hired along with other photographers by the WRA to produce thousands of images. But instead of focusing on smiling faces, Lange went out of her way to embed critique of the government policy into her government-sponsored photographs, and most of her images were censored during the war. Lange is well known for her documentary photographs of the Great Depression, most notably Migrant Mother from 1936, which you see on the left. In addition to emphasizing pathos through forlorn facial expression, Lange also used the strategy of embedding commentary into her images by photographing signs. You can see on the right how she sets up irony as the viewer is forced to contrast destitute families camping under a billboard that reads, "Travel while you sleep." Lange used these same visual techniques in her WRA photographs. This photograph, which Lange made in Oakland in April 1942, was captioned, quote, "Following evacuation orders, this store at 13th and Franklin Streets was closed. The owner, a University of California graduate of Japanese descent, placed the 'I am an American' sign on the store on December 8th, the day after Pearl Harbor." And I would like us to take a minute to look a little closer at this image and get a better sense of how Lang embedded her photographs with layers of meaning. So the sign placed by the owner coexists with other signs on the storefront. The store's name, Grocery Wanto, which is also reiterated on the windows, its offerings of fruits and vegetables, and above them all, a very large realty sign that reads sold. The signs express a distressing trajectory from business owner to suspect to deportee. The sold sign overrides them, the signs below it, and transforms the plea, I am an American, into a poignant artifact of a failed attempt to preserve the business. For no expression of loyalty was sufficient to avoid a process of incarceration based on race rather than an individual's actual politics. In addition to these central elements, other more subtle displays of signs add layers of meaning. The building's surface also reveals a torn poster, an advertisement for Philip Morris, a row of Japanese characters that reads East Bay Merchant Company, and a poster of a person by the store's entrance. In front of the store sits a car, a mailbox, and an electricity pole. To the left of the building, the viewer is led around the corner to other buildings with other cars parked out front. Sandwiched in between the pole and the row of Japanese characters along the left side of the grocery is a US flag, which flies atop a multi-storied building. In the flattened space of the photograph, the flag flies next to the row of characters, thus linking the iconic symbols of the United States and Japan, flag characters, to their indexical expression in the lettered signs on the front of the building. I am an American, Grocery Wanto. This remarkable feat of juxtaposition points to the juncture of the Japanese and the American, while the sold sign seems to question whether that nexus of identity can be sustained. Although official photographers such as Lang produced thousands of images, mostly black and white, vernacular everyday images of life made by people who were incarcerated are rare because cameras were forbidden from being brought into the camps. Occasional snapshots and some home movies exist. And once Japanese American soldiers returned to their families behind barbed wire while on furlough, they often brought cameras with them. Manzanar in Southern California provides another exception with the opening of a photography studio run by Toyomi Itake, a professional photographer from Los Angeles, and most of the camps produced newspapers and school yearbooks that were photographically illustrated. So you can imagine my surprise, given the prohibition on cameras, when legal scholar Eric Muller reached out to me and sent me a link to an online gallery of color photographs, snapshots made inside Hard Mountain, Wyoming. The photographer, Bill Manbo, was an amateur, a hobbyist, and his experience in Hard Mountain became framed through his camera's lens. The images came from the basement of Bill Manbo's son, Billy, and are the largest cache of color photographs of the incarceration that we currently know of. You might also imagine that my first question was, how did Manbo get access to a camera? The answer to this question came in documents located in the National Archives, which reveal how WRA officials debated the contraband status of the camera. Some believed that incarcerated citizens should have access to cameras as long as they were imprisoned outside of the Western Defense Command. In a letter dated October 26, 1942, to WRA Director Dylan Meyer, WRA Regional Director Joseph Smart dismissed the fear that Japanese Americans would use cameras to photograph, quote, military objectives. Smart reasoned that Japanese Americans should have the right to create a photographic record of their lives, quote, particularly to record the lives of their youngsters in an informal fashion, unquote. So Smart is arguing here for the right to the family snapshot. Bill Manbo often focused his lens lovingly on his own son. The photographs of Billy have all the poignancy that any photograph of youth lost to time might have, and attest to the childhood that Bill carved out for his son. A document in the Manzanar archives at UCLA tells the story of a young Nisei mother who lamented her lack of access to a camera while she was incarcerated because she could not document the growth of her only daughter. Manzanar was inside the Western Defense Command, so the individual access that Bill Manbo had to cameras did not extend to this Nisei mother. She writes, quote, "Here our children are getting older day by day, and once their childhood is gone, nothing on this earth can bring it back. And if we have no mementos of their growth, we feel cheated and a little bitter to think that just a snapshot now and then, even if it is taken in a concentration camp, is better than nothing at all," end quote. Most Japanese Americans have a large gap in their family albums from World War II. Bill Mambo's photographs allow us to repopulate those pages with family portraits, children playing, and other scenes of daily life, and recognize the significance that photographs play in everyday acts of representation. Discussions of photography and rights often focus on images that contain documentary evidence of crimes, death, or torture. But during the incarceration, the denial of the camera was part of the eclipsing of a wide range of rights, some constitutional, imprisonment without due process, and others that were part of a more informal array of rights that included the right to representation, cameras as contraband. The argument to restore the right to photography was not embedded primarily in a wish to document the suffering that the imprisonment caused, but rather in the wish to document daily events that continued in spite of the imprisonment. And through the vernacular photograph, reclaim a piece of the rights of citizenship. As Ariel Azoulay argues in the Civil Contract of Photography, quote, "Becoming a citizenry of photography entails seeking by means of photography to rehabilitate one's citizenship or that of someone else who's been stripped of it," end quote. The very ordinariness of the practice of photographing a young boy at play signifies how essential these kinds of everyday snapshots are for constructing a normal sense of self. In this Mambo photograph, dancers' arms spread like wings with fingertips outstretched and palms facing down. The dancers keep time as they move in a circle, one foot forward while their eyes gaze at the ground. The colors of the dancers' costumes are vibrant. One woman wears a beautiful kimono belted in red. A man to her left is decked out in empty food containers, accented with chaotic paper ruffles and front plates of cardboard armor fashioned from Rice Krispies boxes. Their joyous motion contrasts sharply with the drab barrack backdrop, where thin lines of wood run vertically, breaking up the tar paper into repeating black bands. Regularity, sparseness, and imprisonment may mark the setting, but celebration, color, and life mark the participants. Families who had been identified by numbers, whose Americanness and citizenship were trumped by ancestry, rejoice here in a ceremony of ancestral remembrance. In this Mambo photograph of Bonadori during the Festival of Oban, the coexistence of the Japanese and the American is perhaps best expressed in the cereal boxes that adorn the dancer's costume and express a kind of cultural integration that denies the assumption that Japanese and American were mutually exclusive categories. As David Yu writes, quote, "In their day-to-day lives, Nisei moved between many spheres and occupied multiple identities. Hence, it makes little sense to argue for an authentic self that somehow was either Japanese or American. The more compelling question is to ask how Nisei negotiated the complexities of identity formation in the toss and tumble of their times," end quote. In the toss and tumble of his time at Heart Mountain, Mambo used his camera to construct family and community and to make sense of a world in which his autonomy and citizenship had been denied. More recently, my scholarship has moved to consider the period known as resettlement, as thousands of Japanese Americans left camp for new homes, often in the Midwest. I examined photographically illustrated pamphlets and argue that Japanese American mobility out of camp was contingent on immobility, as the US government compelled them to prove their loyalty and patriotism to the nation through confinement. As the camps were dismantled, the government initially forbade Japanese Americans from returning to the West Coast and instead created a network of resettlement offices to encourage their dispersal throughout the Midwest and East Coast. Photographs published in books and pamphlets became tools to persuade Americans outside of the concentration camps that Japanese Americans could be rewoven into the body politic and to assure Japanese Americans that better lives awaited them on the outside. One booklet titled Outcasts, published by the Fellowship of Reconciliation, quoted the words of a child imprisoned in the US who said, quote, "Mother, I don't like Japan. Let's go back to America," end quote. His words point to the incongruities produced by the incarceration. Geographically stable citizens became immobile prisoners and then migrants in their own homeland. For both the imprisoners and the imprisoned, those incongruities blurred the categories of domestic and foreign. The child registered the domestic as foreign, as if life behind barbed wire were discordant with American ideals. The US government also registered the domestic as foreign by allowing Asian ancestry to cancel out birthright citizenship. While the child located the foreign in geographic space, an issue that could be solved through migration, let's go back to America, the US located foreignness in Japanese American bodies, or, as Hearst columnist Henry McLemore opined in 1942, in their very blood. Japanese Americans faced the real possibility of perpetual foreign status, a position that geographic migration could not reconcile, but that representational rebranding through photography potentially could. Another booklet titled Relocation of Japanese Americans, published by the WRA in 1943, had the same target audience as Outcasts and the same goal of making Japanese Americans palatable to Americans outside camp. The opening photograph of the booklet in the National Archives visualized this process of Americanization through incarceration with a picture of a young woman at work. Dressed in a broad lapelled sports coat with a wide collared plaid shirt peeking out, hair curled and pulled back behind her ears, this woman stares down at the object of her work. She appears to be trimming loose threads from a large piece of fabric, the US flag. The photograph invokes the historical trope of Betsy Ross to suggest that this Japanese American woman, by sewing the flag, contributes to the crafting of the very fabric of democracy. The woman, almost certainly an American citizen by birth, sews the icon of liberty while imprisoned because of her ancestry. Stripped of constitutional protections, Nisei had to forgo their rights as Americans in order to prove their loyalty as Americans. For Nisei, the contradictions sewn into the stars and stripes must have been all too clear. Historian Roger Daniels called the incarceration of Japanese Americans, quote, "a link in the chain of racism that stretched back to the earliest contact between Asians and whites on American soil," end quote. That chain extends into the 21st century, as the history of Japanese American incarceration resonates with contemporary political discourse that has framed groups, including immigrants risking their lives to cross our southern border, and Muslim Americans as dangerous, disloyal, and somehow incompatible with the body politic. And we've seen over the past year a resurgence of anti-Asian and anti-Asian American violence. The organization Stop Asian American Pacific Islander Hate released a press statement just last month in February, citing over 2,800 documented cases of racist harassment just between March and December of 2020. These are frequent reminders that the status of what Mainai refers to as alien citizenship also continues to shape Asian American experience. The US remains haunted by this legacy of racial exclusion, deeply rooted in the nation's past and threatening to take new forms in the present. To conclude, I'd like to introduce you to one related public history project I've been deeply involved with. I serve as a lead academic advisor and content curator for The Orange Story, the first installment of a larger project called Japanese American World War II Confinement, a cinematic digital history project. I began working with filmmakers and web designers to combine original, scripted, historically based fiction film with historically grounded archival content in a seamless online experience. And I will just play for you the trailer.
Along the entire Pacific coast, some 120,000 enemy aliens and American-born Japanese are preparing to
As lead content curator, I've worked closely with a larger team and guided a group of students to research, develop, and curate 4 chapters of archival documents, images, oral histories, and videos that provide historical context for the themes raised in the film. Each chapter is akin to an online exhibition and contains buckets of curated content with interstitial quotes and GIFs. Funded by the National Park Service's Japanese American Confinement Sites Grant, this project seeks to leverage the emotional power of historically based fiction film to engage audiences, particularly high school students who might not be familiar with this history. In this project, we're including documentary photographs in the curated buckets of archival materials, and some photographs, particularly those by Lang, influenced the vantage point of the director while shooting the film. We're currently at work on the 3rd segment of the story, which takes place in Chicago. So I will stop there and close with that. Thank you all so much for attending, and I look forward to joining in the conversation shortly.
I have to say that that was fantastic, and I'm much looking forward to the questions too. And if people have questions, you can go ahead and put them in the Q&A. But for now, let me introduce Katharyne Mitchell so we can think about these 2 presentations that we have tonight kind of next to each other. I think that's going to be an interesting counterpoint. Katharyne Mitchell, thank you so much for joining us, is Dean of the Social Sciences and Professor of Sociology at UC Santa Cruz. Her current research explores the role of faith-based organizations in providing humanitarian aid and refuge to migrants. Recent books include Making Workers, Radical Geographies of Education, and the co-edited Handbook on Critical Geographies of Migration. She's working on a monograph entitled Sanctuary Space, Memories of Insurgency. She's the author of over 100 articles and book chapters and recipients of grants from the MacArthur Foundation, Spencer Foundation, Fulbright Foundation, and National Science Foundation. She received a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2016. Thank you, Katharyne.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that introduction. And thanks to you and Jennifer for inviting me. And thanks to all the listeners who are here. If you're local, it's a beautiful day. So I really appreciate your spending the time with us today. And a big welcome to Jasmine Alinder, should I say, the great Jasmine Alinder. We're really, really delighted to have you here at UC Santa Cruz. So let me start. I will try to share my screen here. And okay, just let me know if it's not working. Otherwise, I'll assume we're all good. Okay, so I want to begin by giving a little bit of context to my talk tonight. I've worked on migration for most of my career, at least well over 25 years. And in the last 5 or 6 years, I've really been focusing on the question of sanctuary and looking at research on refugees who are being protected with sanctuary. And the reason I've chosen that topic is because I find it both theoretically really interesting, but also politically important. And I'm always trying to look for those kinds of combinations in my work. I want to begin with just a little bit of information and some definitions. According to the UNHCR, the number of forcibly displaced people in the world it reached its highest level last year at around 80 million, of whom 26 million or so are refugees and about 4 million are asylum claimants. And I want to just give a note on definitions here before we start. Asylum seekers or asylum claimants are those who are seeking refugee status on the basis of persecution in their home society. And as probably most people here know, since 1951, the Refugee Convention, and then the 1967 protocol that followed that, people who are declared refugees and receive refugee status from nation state are not allowed to be returned to a country where they may be considered unsafe. And that's one of the largest conventions in terms of signatories in the world. In my talk today, I'm going to be speaking mostly about asylum claimants. And one final piece of information before we start. Any asylum claimants in the EU under regulations that are known as Dublin II, now Dublin III, they have to be returned to the first country of arrival into the EU to have their asylum case examined or adjudicated. So for example, if someone is in Germany, and they were fingerprinted and first arrived in Greece or Italy, they can be deported internally within the EU to that country, and they will be. Often these countries are Italy, Greece, and Hungary because of the geographies of arrival. However, and this is a critical point when we're looking at sanctuary practices in Germany, if you manage to not get deported within the first 6 months that you've been in Germany or another country, you can stay and have your case examined there in Germany. So sanctuary, in a way, in a German church that is often for 6 months in order to avoid this internal EU deportation to somewhere, a hotspot in Italy, Hungary, or Greece often. And you might think, well, what difference does it make if they're in the EU, they're going to have their case examined? Well, this is just an example of one of the asylum processing centers, these places where people are held up to have their cases looked at in Greece. I went there in 2016. A photo on the left is from that time period. The photo on the right is from 2017, a year later. And you can see that the conditions continually deteriorated. And in fact, last year, Moria burned down after several people had died, and then several people died in the fire as well. So the conditions in these so-called hotspot detention centers are really horrific. In Europe, it was the years 2015 to 16 that were my main fieldwork period. And it was a time, if you recall, when a particularly large number of asylum seekers arrived from the Middle East, mainly Syria, and to a certain lesser extent from North Africa. Germany accepted over 1 million in 2015. And that summer, you often heard the language of crisis. Of course, it wasn't a crisis really for people in Europe. The crisis were the people who were forcibly displaced and had to leave their home countries. But and additionally, it's important to know that most refugees and displaced people are in fact hosted in other regions of the world, often in less developed countries. Nevertheless, there were major struggles over the appropriate role of Germany and the rest of Europe in taking in these refugees and asylum claimants during that time. And there was a strong growth and an acceleration of anti-immigrant and white supremacist sentiments and movements at this time. Here you're looking at some movements in Germany. One was Pegida, which is an anti-Islamization movement, and also AfD, Alternative for Deutschland. Both are still active today. This put pressure on centrists such as Merkel to move politically to the right. And indeed, if we look back at that time period, we could see that that was a moment when many European governments did move to the right politically, particularly in response to those seeking refugee status. So this is the political context for my research in the fall of 2016. So what did I go to do? My interest was in how faith-based actors, migrant activists, and other allies worked together to combat this growing anti-immigrant sentiment and violence in Europe, and to carve out zones of safety for refugees and asylum seekers by turning to the ethics, the practices, and the politics and spaces of sanctuary. And by sanctuary, I'm talking here about the literal physical protection of a human being in a church. So I'm not talking about the sanctuary cities movement as we are seeing here. I'm not talking about hospitality or general welcome or spiritual aid or even sort of politics at the abstract level. Really, this is where you put someone in a church and you try to protect them from the police taking them out and deporting them, often for a period of 6 months, which, as I said, keeps them from being deported even internally within the EU. Now, the actual numbers of this kind of physical refuge in a church are relatively low compared to the overall numbers of refugees and asylum seekers in Germany at this time. But what I'm going to argue and show, I think, today is that symbolically, this move is extremely important and has wide reverberations that impact migration and refugee policy more generally. Now, this image is from a conference that I attended on migrant activism and a church asylum at the Heiligkreuz Church in Berlin. And this church will come back in my talk frequently because it was the first to offer sanctuary in Germany in 1983. And it's been incredibly active in this sphere since that time. And the conference was held by a group called the German Ecumenical Committee on Church Asylum, or GECA, which I'm also going to be talking about again. So GECA is a Protestant network of churches active in the sanctuary movement in Europe. So why sanctuary? So sanctuary comes from the Latin sanctus, and that means holy. And it has played a strategic role in the political resistance for hundreds of years. The concept of the practices of sanctuary have returned time and again, including if we look back at with the Underground Railroad in the 19th century, and the Quakers used the term of sanctuary in the 1980s sanctuary movement in the US, when people were fleeing the Reagan regime in Central America. And we could see that really taking off in Tucson, but is spreading across the whole country in the US in the 1980s, as well as this time in Germany I'm looking at in the 2010s and 2000 up till now. And I became really interested in how this works. And what I mean is how this concept and associated practices can be reactivated in times when it's needed. So I began to focus on the spaces, probably because I'm a geographer, but the literal physical spaces of church-based sanctuary practices, the structure, the physical structure, the stones, the neighborhood of the church itself. And I became interested in how those spaces are constitutive of collective memory. And by that, I mean collective memories of alternative justice and resistance, such that the older concepts through history, through time, and through space, the older concepts and practices can be and are reactivated to transform the actions, spaces, and possibilities of the present. So this is going to be a little tiny potted history here because we only have 20 minutes, so apologies. Sanctuary has existed since late antiquity, and it was offered by the Greeks, Romans, and Hebrews at different times. It was initially affiliated with cities of refuge and other secular sites, but it began to involve churches and faith-based practices starting in the 4th century. Indeed, it was the early church that started to spread sanctuary practices throughout Europe, where people accused of certain kinds of crimes could be offered sanctuary in the church and thus protected from arrest. Church asylum was recognized in English law up until the 17th century, and in German law up until the late 18th century. And I don't have time to go into why that is now, but if you're interested, we can talk about in the Q&A, because it's kind of fascinating. Why did the nation state allow that to continue? And even as we can see, even after Enlightenment rationalities developed, and with the importance of the rule of law and systems of good governance, and those began to override these types of practices, of these medieval practices, there remained factions that held on to some of these ideals of sanctuary, especially the notion of a space of protection outside sovereign authority. Indeed, some 19th century English reformers hailed this way of thinking as one where the escape from sovereign justice through the provision of church sanctuary could be conceptualized as a form of alternative justice. Sanctuary enabled those who were fleeing enraged victims in the Middle Ages and earlier a framework for reconciliation. It was in effect a form of time out, as well as a space away, in which the affected parties could try to come to a mutually agreed upon solution without bloodshed or sovereign intervention. And that sort of sense of the time out is something that we see in Germany, where the churches they're not going to protect the person forever. They say if we protect them for 6 months, they can at least have their case examined right away in Germany with a fair judicial system and without having to wait in these horrible hotspot detention centers for often 5, 6, 7 years. So what this tells us is that there's this important cultural tradition, which is meaningful even in highly secular societies today. And it's a tradition that's spatially based and where the spaces evoke memories of alternative justice. And not just evoke these memories, they positively evoke these memories. But even more than this, these spaces have real power. They have the power to affect normative structures, the structures of national sovereignty. Because if you think about it, what does a nation state have in terms of what it can do, its rights? It protects its borders, right? It's one of its key things that a nation state has territory and has the right to protect its borders and decide who can come in and who can't. Well, this practice in and of itself is a challenge to that right. And it also has the knock-on effect of challenges to the system of justice, to the policing arm of the state. So how does this work? Well, at least partially, this power is based on the cultural tradition of sacred space. So passed down over generations, notions of exceptional, holy, or sacred space afforded the church a certain power in the wider landscape. As such, it creates a location that is to some degree off limits to the sovereign. And when I say the sovereign, I mean a bounded notion of power, whether either that's a monarchy or a nation state, but a place where the power resides in a single authority and sense of control. So to legitimize sanctuary practices, religious institutions and actors continually call upon something older. They call on theological tradition and divine law. And this ecclesiastical legacy works alongside and often against the orthodox authority and bounded spaces of sovereign forms of power. So how do church networks like GECA use the power of sanctuary to provide refugee protection today? One way is through media publicity. Although the police have the legal right to enter a church and remove asylum seekers in Germany, this is rarely done now because of the tremendous negative publicity it produces. So leaders and volunteers at GECA, working for GECA, for example, make sure that every refugee removal from a church is made known nationally and internationally. They get on and they call the press right away and they say, this is happening, this is happening. And because of this, of the historical and cultural traditions that I was talking about, even in largely secular societies such as Germany, when the police do go in and grab someone, it creates major negative effects for them. This is an example where it's one of several incidents in that year of 2016 when the police went in and removed someone. And the importance of the actual physical spaces of the church in defending the refugees and in galvanizing public support against refugee removal by state actors is very clear in all these cases. And it's commented on here by Birgitta Neufert, who is a volunteer working at GECA during that time, who I was able to interview in 2016. So I'm not going to read this. I'm going to let you take a moment to read that quote. And here's one more example of a forced removal from a church in Iceland. This is also in 2016. It was the removal of 2 Iraqi teenagers who were seeking sanctuary in a Lutheran church. And what I want to show in this particular instance is the way that this removal and deportation engendered really strong feelings, even by the pastor, who I would have said, I interviewed her, and I would have said that she was quite a centrist in terms of state-church relations in Iceland until this action. The perceived defilement of the physical sacred spaces of the church was pivotal in driving extreme emotions expressed by the key actors who were involved in this. So I want to note here how this kind of action is not only made public and has an impact on the national and international stage because of the media publicity, but it also has the effect of radicalizing actors who are involved in it. And then they become people who are willing to challenge, for example, the national nation state right to make the laws around certain kinds of refugee and asylum claimant movements and challenge those, and if they feel like they're not ethical. So these are examples of where the historical and cultural traditions of the sacred space of the church are used to literally, physically try to block the police from going in and grabbing someone, or if they do, to publicly shame and denounce state actors. So this is the Heilige Kreuz Church, and I want to turn now to the wider spaces in which churches such as this one are located, and the relationships that are formed through time that often tie church space to neighborhood space to particular people or actors who are involved in those spaces. Further, I would argue these wider spaces, the alive, embodied, contemporary spaces and relationships of existing people are linked to these historical traditions and textual references, particularly stories from the Bible. So this is the Heilige Kreuz Church. It was built in 1885, but then bombed out and rebuilt, bombed out in the war and rebuilt in 1951 through 59. And it was located after the war in a very, very poor immigrant neighborhood. And the pastors there since that period have been dealing with extreme poverty and racism and xenophobia. And in the last 10 to 20 years, extreme gentrification, very rapid gentrification. So the church has become known throughout the entire neighborhood, in fact, the whole community of Berlin, on behalf of, for its work on behalf of the homeless, on behalf of refugees, on behalf of the marginalized in society. And a lot of the international conferences on sanctuary and migrant aid have been held at this church, including one in 2010, and then the one that I started with in 2016. And they're almost always organized by GECA. So I conducted an interview with the pastor of Jürgen Quandt, who was the pastor at the time of the first in the 1980s. During a break in the sanctuary conference Beyond Borders. He was one of the earliest pastors to start offering sanctuary in Germany. So I asked him about how and why it began. And his reply indicates the ways that the past, collective memory, religious texts, and place are brought into the present. So here's the story. In 1983, some Palestinians came to the church, the Heilige Kreuz Church, and asked him to protect them. They were going to be deported. They came to him and to that church because of his prior actions on behalf of his congregation, as well as the history of that specific church as a radical site of action in the neighborhood. This is what he said to me in the interview in 2016. They asked us, what can we do? I was a priest here since 1980. They asked, can't you help us? I said, yes, what should we do? They said, you have an old rite, asylum in the church. It is from the medieval period. In the Bible, you can find stories, come into the sanctuary. This is your tradition, you should do it. I initially said no. I said, here we have modern laws and rights, but they said, we think you should. I said, okay, I'll discuss it with my members of council. So I want to underscore several things from this quote. Those requesting the pastor's support are phrasing their request for protection and aid to a specific actor and a specific church in a specific neighborhood. Similarly, when they reference the Bible and stories of coming into the sanctuary, they say, this is your tradition. The articulation of textual scripture and spatial location is notable. By tradition, they are referring to both the traditions they are aware of from biblical writings and the supportive anti-hegemonic traditions of the Heilige Kreuz Church and its progressive pastors. The reference encompasses alternative justice traditions in two different registers. According to Pastor Wolf-Dieter Just, who was another important figure in the early sanctuary movement in Germany, this congregation said yes to shielding these families at that time because they were open to refugees already and they supported their pastor politically. As Quandt noted further in the interview, the church asylum movement in Germany quickly expanded after this initial successful sanctuary protection of the Palestinians in 1983. It gained awareness and public support in 1984 after the violent removal of a woman and her children from a church in Hamburg. an action that angered many and brought both national recognition of church asylum and widespread opposition to forced church removals. Following this, sanctuary incidents increased and church asylum networks developed both locally and regionally, including GECA, which was formed in 1994. So GECA now has members all across Germany, but a key node in the network remains the Heiligkreuz Church and its associated actors in Berlin. In 2010, GECA held a major international conference there entitled New Sanctuary Movement in Europe, Healing and Sanctifying Movement in the Churches. It was attended by individual actors, NGOs, and faith-based activists from all and institutions from all across Europe, as well as Canada and the United States. Conference speakers included the well-known sanctuary activist John Fife, who had been a major figure in the sanctuary movement in the 1980s in Tucson, Arizona. And many others who came and spoke at this conference and shared stories, what worked, what didn't, what to think about, how to make this a bigger movement, how to apply pressure on policy. So this kind of network, I'd say, that crosses both time and space is emblematic of the sanctuary movement today. So in these last examples, I wanted to show some of the ways that the physical space and structure of a specific church and associated church network help to ground and anchor and expand articulated memories of alternative justice, including textual memories involving stories and traditions from the Bible, and by doing so, formed a temporary refuge of protection for asylum claimants in Germany and now worldwide. And I wanted to show how an attention to sanctuary in all its concreteness can help us see how these international networks of faith-based and other migrant activists rely on the recovery and reuse of collective memories, memories that are sedimented in space and which brush against the dominant landscape of the present, opening up new nodes of resistance and justice for refugees in Europe and globally. So thank you. I will stop screen sharing and come back to life here. See if we can get everybody to join us. Yay, everybody's here.
Thank you so much for those wonderful presentations. I think that they're super interesting next to each other. Do you want to start us off with a question, Jennifer?
Yeah, thank you so much. These were really wonderful presentations. And I wanted to ask, both of your talks address conditions of forced migration and citizenship, and there's this wonderful element that brings them together. With Japanese internment, photography plays a critical role in the acts of communication and reintegration, sort of those two sides. And in Germany, the church is a site of recognition and recovery. What I'd kind of like to ask is, can you say more about how the idea of rights in these examples relies on both visibility and invisibility? I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure, shall I start? And then, yeah, so this is always a key question for activists in the world of sanctuary. Because what visibility can do is, of course, make a particular case something larger, right? And so you're hiding just a family in a church, but then if you let people know that that's happening, or a church where there's a church action where people are removed, that can become something that scales up and helps you to affect policy, put pressure on policy makers, may potentially change law at a higher scale. But at the same time, every time you render an individual or a family or a group visible, you potentially put them at risk. And so this is a big set of, as a conundrum and set of discussions that people hold in this community all the time. And also, wanting to make sure that you're not acting on someone to use them as an example, rather than having them be the activists, the migrants, the refugees, the asylum seekers themselves, be the people that are really making those decisions about what they want to see. Do they want to just go undercover, or would they rather, have their case be one that goes onto the national stage? And I'll just give one more example of this in real time. When I was at the University of Washington, the president of our university was put under a lot of pressure to make our campus a sanctuary campus. And this is at a time when Trump had just been elected, and there was all kinds of concerns rightful concerns, as it turns out, about what was going to happen to people who are at risk of deportation. And she said, she is a Latina immigrant herself, and she said, I am not making this campus a sanctuary campus because I don't want the spotlight on us. I don't want them to see our DACA students. I don't want them to see our undocumented students. And so she made that decision, and I think that was the right decision to make, but it was fraught because a lot of student activists said, why aren't you making our campus? Don't you care? And so it is this kind of, you have to make these kinds of calculations, just as you suggested.
Yeah, I'll just add that, visibility obviously can be a double-edged sword. I was trying to, I think, articulate visibility in different registers, at least photographic visibility, so that on the one hand, there's the issue of being photographically visible to oneself and one's family, and having access to the means of representation to do that. And then on the other hand, there's visibility in the kind of public relations sense that in order to counter anti-Japanese, racism, there was the WRA photographers made something like 17,000 photographs, and the key point of those photographs was to help with the re-assimilation of Japanese Americans outside of camp. So almost as soon as the WRA takes over administering the camps, they are already thinking about the fact that Japanese Americans are going to have to leave, going to have to go back into American quote unquote society outside of barbed wire, and that kind of visibility would be really important for doing that. However, there's an oversaturation in a sense, and there were some documents that I was reading in the National Archives when I was doing research on the pamphlets, where there's an exchange. They're trying to send photographers out to different areas where Japanese Americans had relocated to take photographs to show, like, look at this person cleaning house. Aren't they contributing to society? And complaints coming in from the owner of the house who was employing the house cleaner, that she didn't want that kind of visibility. She didn't want people to know that she had a Japanese American woman working in her home, and please, no more cameras. So yeah, absolutely. Visibility and visibility, they go hand in hand.
I'm going to actually ask my own question too, Jasmine, that one of the things I was thinking about when I was watching it was the way that some of the images you were showing were redeployed when the election of the past president in the exhibition, Then They Came for Us, right? That was shown. So I saw it in New York at the ICP, and then I know that it also traveled really heavily around the United States, because there became a moment of increased kind of thinking about what was going to happen with migrants in the United States, and then as it played out, and wanting to really relook at this history. So I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about how the kind of image discourse is being connected to the present. And I think, Katharyne, there's also a question here for you about the ways in which you're talking about collective memory and history, the way space holds it. So I think that we have these kind of two ways that the images hold it, the spaces hold it. How do we activate these within the current moment and the struggles in the United States too?
Yeah, Rachel, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts about Then They Came for Us. I saw it in Chicago, and both found it really moving. And in particular, I was really grateful that they had done so much work to try to track down and identify the people who were in a lot of the photographs that they used and tell sort of individual stories behind them. As a photo historian, I wished that they had done more to talk about the context of the photographs themselves, who was taking the pictures, why they were made in the way, how they were deployed at the time, and how they have been since then. But I would, absolutely say that Japanese Americans today have really led the advocacy charge, against the creation of, camps for immigrants and families. And they've really been at the forefront. I don't know if you know about Densho, which is an organization based in Seattle, but really, most of their materials are online. I highly recommend their website. They have incredible resources for teachers, a pretty incredible archive, and their focus is oral history, and have collected and created many, many video oral histories of Japanese Americans. And Densho, I think really with the election of Trump in 2016 in particular, decided to become, extremely political and vociferous in their support for immigrant rights and trying to make the parallels between Japanese American history and what was happening and what is still happening in this country today.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I have to say, I've always been fascinated by memory. Memory is so important. And it's no accident that it gets struggled over, because who controls the past, of course, controls the present and the future, right? And so that's why you see all these struggles over monuments and various kinds of memorialization. And right now we're really fascinated by, or not fascinated by, but a lot of people are looking at how memory has been held in the landscape through, in negative ways, through like Confederate statues and things like that. But and of course, the church has often been not on the side of progressive causes. It's also, depending on whose church and who's running it and who's in it, can be much the opposite of that. But I became interested in these sort of progressive leftist churches that would keep recalling both stories. They would often reference like Matthew 35, welcome the stranger, which by the way is in all theological traditions, this idea of welcoming the stranger, but often reference these kinds of what they would conceptualize as higher laws and a dignity of the human being that they found in scripture and for them in texts that are important to them. But that was then linked to these literal physical spaces. So there was a way that I felt like that those ideas could continue through time as well as across space, because there was these repositories where people would, even the sense of the sanctuary, the altar, like people would say, oh, they didn't just take the person out of the church, they took them out of the altar space. I mean, it was even like layered kinds of meanings that had so much power for people, and how those memories got sedimented in these spaces, and then for hundreds of years you might not need it, and then you have an election of Trump or certain governments in Europe, and you think better return to that sense of alternative justice, and we know exactly where to find it. So that was why I'm interested in the exteriorization of memory through space, but also like what Jasmine does through other things too, like through photographs, through all kinds of archival things that we draw on to form ourselves as subjects, ideally resistant, subjects resistant to evil, to hegemonic systems that are not working to the advantage of human beings.
So can I say something else about memory and place?
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to mention, sometimes people ask me, what put me down the path of this, research. And I was friends with a photographer named Patrick Nagatani, and I got to know him when I was a student at University of New Mexico. And I left to go to University of Michigan, but stayed in contact with him. This was in the mid 1990s. And he was writing me, and he was talking about this new body of work that he had created called Japanese American Concentration Camp. He's Sansei, third generation Japanese American, born just after the war. And as is the case with, not unusual for Sansei, had heard his parents talking about camp when he was growing up, but didn't really learn about the history and didn't really understand what kind of camp they were discussing until he was older. And so in mid-career, he decides that he wants to really investigate this part of his own family history. And he decides it's really important for him to go to the sites where the camps, the 10 main camps were. So he actually calls the project Virtual Pilgrimage. And he goes to each of the 10 sites and he photographs basically color landscape photographs of what's left there. And he also used it as an opportunity to talk about this history with his own son. He took his son along on some of the trips that he took, but it really became important that he was making the images in the physical space, documenting the sort of remains of what was left behind and what was still there decades later.
So we have questions actually from Chris Connery from each of you. So I thought that I would say them. They're not the same question. But Jasmine, Chris asked for you is if you wondered if you'd had a chance to look at other relocation photo archives. For instance, the Italian Americans in Santa Cruz and other coastal towns were required to move inland if they were too close to the coast. So he's wondering about the different photo treatments of different populations within this, and if you've had time to do that kind of comparative work.
I haven't, but I would love to. I'm so, and I've been in the state of Wisconsin for a long time. And oftentimes when I give talks like this, I have to start really from the beginning. It's, honestly, it's still, unfortunately, a history that too many people in the country aren't well aware of. So no, Chris, I haven't done that. And I would love to learn more about where these photographs are located so that I can start to take a look at them.
So then Katharyne, Chris's question for you is about what he knows about medieval sanctuary practice in England and Europe, and that those seeking sanctuary were generally accused of crime, and sanctuary then was an extra legal space, as you said, had parallels with other exceptional times when the law was suspended, such as carnival. So when did modern sanctuary practices begin, he asks?
Well, I think I would point to the Underground Railroad. In fact, as I said, people referred to some of those practices as sanctuary. The Quakers who were involved in the railroad did. And then from then I would leapfrog up until to the 1980s, which is when we really see the term occurring again. There are probably other moments in history where the church was protecting people from, in extra legal ways, but they didn't use those concepts or make those links public, at least. So the 1980s, starting in Tucson and then in Chicago and LA, and then from there, really interesting kind of movement across space as people in Berlin were listening to what was going on in Tucson and other places, and then later in 2016, they brought Fife over and so there was this sort of fertilization that was across time as well as across space.
Jennifer, did you want to put anything in here? I know that we're in this funny space where we have to figure out how to talk around each other. There's lots of great questions, I have to say, coming in for the chat. But
okay.
There are some wonderful questions coming in on the chat. And I thought maybe we could go to a recent question that came in from a graduate student, Michelle Yee. And this is a question for Dean Allender. I was wondering if you'd reflect on the role of photography/video, both by surveillance cameras and by personal devices in capturing recent anti-Asian violence, as well as other racist violence, and then disseminated through social media. How do these images function in relation to the narratives of our current nation state and the history that is currently being written? Similar to Rachel's question, I think, to some degree. It seems interesting to me that much of the narrative around Japanese American incarceration revolved around a particular interiority and suggested a particular kind of Americanness, whereas contemporary social media surveillance photographs function in the public in places of encounters between strangers. It's a really, I think, interesting question.
Yeah, and that goes back to the visibility being a trap, or that kind of double-edged sword of visibility. It just made me think of, I didn't have time to talk about Ansel Adams's work from Manzanar, but it made me think of that. His project, he titled Born Free and Equal. And the title alone is creates a particular category of Americanness that excludes Issei. So first generation, Japanese Americans were in fact not born in this country free and equal. And so it was while he was trying again to counter, caricatures, anti-Asian images, he did it in a way that celebrated Nisei at the kind of expense of the generation of Issei. In terms of, surveillance now, I think I showed, oh yeah, I did. Okay, so the image that I used for the cover of Moving Images is a Dorothea Lange image of news photographers walking down a sidewalk. And I really wanted to explore, and I think this is probably, true in terms of surveillance today, not just the kinds of representational practices, but the way that the camera influences, in fact, what's being pictured. So the presence of the camera itself, right? Especially, I mean, in this example, in the historical example in the 1940s, these are pretty large pieces, generally, of camera equipment. So there was, it wasn't, in the image that I showed, it's a family walking down a sidewalk with belongings on each side of the sidewalk. So they're outside on a public street, and there's news photographers lined up on both sides. So it's sort of doubling down on the kind of humiliation of this process. Not only am I, being forced to wear a tag with a number on it instead of my name, and face that kind of dehumanization, but the camera is in my face recording this. Surveillance, there's a lot to say about surveillance now. It's not a subject that I usually talk about in terms of my own research, but I mean, this is being recorded, is it not? It will be put up on the web. I mean, it's not a question I oftentimes when I'm teaching history of photography, I ask students to think about how often and in what context their image is taken at any given day. And, the list, well, maybe in pandemic times, less so because it's, mostly through computers and on our phones. But when one's out and about, the list it's endless, right? There's cameras everywhere. The flip side of that is who's doing the looking. So it's this sort of, that kind of like panopticon, right? Is that at any given time, you could be under surveillance, but part of the power is you don't exactly know necessarily who's looking or when.
Thank you.
I think there's a follow-up question too with it, well, that we can tie back in, because Satsuki Ina wrote in a question in which they mentioned that, of course, their mother was one of the subjects of Dorothea Lange's photos during the removal period in San Francisco. And the photo has been used in venues and presentations and repurposed in all these ways. So thinking about the role of anonymity imposed on the subjects in the midst of the trauma, and wanting you to talk a little bit about that.
Right, yeah, because in fact, we're talking about, real human beings. I mean, one thing I'll say about Dorothea Lange, and also Ansel Adams, is Lange, thought of herself as a social documentarian. She tried to make connections with people who she photographed to greater or lesser degrees of success. There were interviews with Florence Thompson, who's the woman who's in Migrant Mother. I mean, it's hard to imagine a photograph that's been more reproduced in, more different kinds of contexts than Migrant Mother, and it's an actual person. Of course, that person's history, the person's understanding of what it meant to have her picture taken, because, Lange, she obviously knew that was happening. It was some kind of exchange, but it's not really clear that she benefited very much directly from that kind of exchange. And although her image, certainly became used in ways that she probably couldn't have imagined and Lange couldn't have imagined at the time.
can I add to that? Because there's a, sorry, Jennifer, but there is a really similar question about agency in migrant protection, right? And one of the conferences I went to, there was a discussion among the congregation about the fact that migrants had actually squatted a church near the Heiligkreuz Church in Berlin, and said, we're not waiting for the church to determine whether we should be given refuge, we're taking the church. And there was, it was an interesting sort of discussion by people who said, no, that's too far. That we don't really want the church to go that far and to allow that to happen. When others were saying, they're telling us what we need to do. They're telling us what the right moves are, and that's really, really important for us to hear. So that was amongst the congregants that had this discussion. But it's as you can imagine, it's a very big question in any kind of migrant activism.
Yeah, and I just add to, the connection with agency is on the other side, power. And when Katharyne, when you were talking about alternative justice, I was thinking about how photography could be used to produce alternative histories. So I didn't show it, but in one of the yearbooks from Manzanar, there are two images, one of a hand holding a pair of pliers cutting through the barbed wire, and another one of a high school senior couple nicely dressed with suitcases leaving camp. And the caption on the bottom is "Through these portals to new horizons." And it, the kind of message that image conveys, that these high school seniors are responsible, have the power and agency to leave camp on their own, to reclaim their own rights of citizenship, was pretty powerful.
Well, all of memory is this kind of struggle. Like who gets to present these kinds of images to whom, when, like who takes them, who presents them, where do they get to go? Walter Benjamin talks about the importance of going back into the rubble of history and pulling out the stuff that hasn't been represented, hasn't been told, the stories that haven't been told. And it also disrupts this kind of this notion of a linear trajectory of progress. Like we're always making our way to a better place. In fact, it's not. It's this constellation of events and actions and representations, and you need to go back and find those ones that are missing, or find the voices of the people that are missing as well.
We have far too many questions that are all brilliant here to ask you, but I'm going to do sort of two together for Katharyne. One of them is, in terms of sacred space, did you encounter sanctuaries offered by other religions in addition to Christian institutions? Especially as you indicated, many religions promote hospitality to the stranger. So that's one question. And then the other is also for Katharyne, and this is for Lee. As you know, that historically, church groups sponsored Southeast Asian refugees in the US. Can you speak about how this sanctuary ideology played out historically in the resettlement of Southeast Asian refugees in the US? So if you know anything about that, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, for the first question, there absolutely were many different faiths that were involved, that were and are and remain involved in protecting and working with migrant activists and refugees. My research was primarily in Germany, and it's pretty much a Lutheran Protestant majority, and so that's what I came into contact with. That's who the people I interviewed. So that's where my research went, which isn't to say that there aren't all kinds of other instances. And in fact, there's a lot of other books that are written about other faiths using protecting migrants and people at risk. I'm afraid I don't know about this particular case in the US. My research has really been, it was initially on Asia a long time ago, 20 years ago, and then recently it's been on Europe, but I've actually never done any real research on the US. I think there's a lot of people who do, and I think that was probably maybe why I looked outside.
So I have a question I have to say from Jim Clifford that in some ways was my question too, that I think about all the time, which is about asking you to both reflect on your different intellectual formations as a geographer and a historian. So how do you draw on this training in your work, and how have you been forced to adapt to new situations and problems, theoretical and political? So I think the question of training, you know, your approach to these questions is really interesting.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a big one of those big epistemological questions. Thank you, Jim, wherever you are.
I mean, I'm trained as an art historian. I knew I wanted to be an art historian when I was in high school. My father's a photographer. I grew up around artists, but did not love being in the darkroom back when there were darkrooms with chemicals. And so gravitated, I guess, to the other side of the camera. But when things really changed for me when the historian Roger Daniels reached out to me. And I started to work with him to publish moving images in his series, The Asian American Experience. And I think that he was interested in photography, but he really made me a much better historian. And I started to, I ended up leaving an art history department and joining a history department in Wisconsin at UWM. And it took a while, like in terms of method and research, for me to make sense to my colleagues. So I remember, like, after giving a talk, one of my colleagues raised his hand and he said, "So what are your primary sources?" And I said, "Well, actually, these photographs that I'm talking about are my primary sources." Now, I also go into archives and look at, text-based sources, letters, official documents, et cetera, things that like made more sense to him as a primary source. But I'm actually trying to use these images as my primary sources. And it's like, oh, okay. So, so that, I mean, in the one hand, I was like taken aback and, in a way that I wouldn't have been if I had been with other art historians, but it also gave me a place to function, a space to function, where I spent a lot of my teaching, time working with students, history students, graduate students on, how to use photographs as historical sources. And how to think about them, again, like not as illustrations, not as windows onto the past, but as documents themselves.
Well, it's a big question. I'd say why I love being a geographer is because you have to do theoretical, or you get to do theoretical work and empirical work. And the expectation is that each informs the other. And I have always found that fascinating and difficult at the same time. And sometimes I think I wish I could just read and theorize, and philosophize deeply, or I wish I could be an empiricist and just say this is what the landscape is telling me. Just looking at it without really trying to pretend that I wasn't bringing all my biases to that view. But instead, I mean, what we're asked to do in geography, and not all the social science, but definitely in geography, is to tack back and forth between the theoretical and the empirical, and to test ideas out and see if they're really working in that particular case, and to push theory using what you're seeing on the ground. And I love doing that because I feel like it keeps you honest in a way. It's easy to try to make an argument, and not easy, but one can make an argument that's very beautiful. Like, it's nice to make a beautiful argument, and then try to shove the case into it to make it fit better. And if you're good, you do good empirical work, you don't do that. You're like, actually, this isn't really, it's not quite right, and then my theoretical framework's not quite right, or the argument's not quite right, and you're forced to challenge yourself in terms of what you think you know. And the kinds of methods and tools and literatures you're bringing to bear on that case may not be the right ones. They may not be helping you answer those questions.
Wonderful. I have another question here from Susan Gilman, who says, another comparative question for both Jasmine and Katharyne. Katharyne just mentioned Underground Railroad Sanctuary stops, and I was wondering about Black histories of photography from Frederick Douglass to W.E.B. Du Bois, and of sanctuary practices. Something about the political issues of both forms by different minoritized groups across space, time. That's the question. So does either want to take that sort of a question-like question?
I mean, I'll say that, I don't know, Susan, if you know Pictures of Progress, but the writings of Frederick Douglass on photography and the power of photography and the way that representation, again, could be used both to stereotype African Americans or more honorifically. And Frederick Douglass himself, sat for regular portraits and had them disseminated. So did, I think, Sojourner Truth. So I wished that, I can't remember when that book came out. It's an edited collection, but man, I wished I had read it, 20 years earlier, because Frederick Douglass's writings on photography are, they're pretty inspirational.
Yeah, it's not an area I know well, but I know that there's a lot of interesting work in Black geographies now. For example, people like Catherine McKittrick and Ruthie Gilmore and Tiffany King, who are actually rewriting the spaces of things like the Underground Railroad. And I know this is being done in literature too, but I'm going to let Jasmine talk about that area. But in geography, sort of, even though it's maybe a progressive literature of protection, maybe that way we thought about in the past was a little bit patronizing. Again, it lacked that agency of people that were, seemingly, in the way it's been presented, acted on rather than acting. And a lot of the new Black geographies is really sort of showing the hidden spaces, the attics, the liminal spaces, the shoals, the places where people actively protected themselves and protected others and found interstices of safety that didn't get into the historical narrative. So again, back to the Walter Benjamin, we need to constantly be going back and blasting out sort of normative time and memory from the straitjacket of history. There is no such thing as a past that's fixed. Like, it's always in motion, and it's our job to go back and dislodge those pieces, like the Angel of Progress, fix the things that are broken, but also like see what was represented as broken and who talked about how it was fixed. Like, all those things are up for grabs.
I think that's a wonderful place to end, actually. That's a lovely way to end. So I want to thank both of our distinguished speakers tonight for their time and for their thoughts. And thanks to all of you, our audience, for being with us tonight. Rachel, do you have any closing comments?
I was going to say that the same thing. That was the perfect last couple sentences. And thank you so much. It's just been such a pleasure to be in this space and to hear your thinking and to think about all of this with you. So thank you so much for your time. And thanks for everyone for joining us. And we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.